Welcome to Talking with Tech. My name is Chris Bouguet, and I'm here with Rachel Madel. How's it going, Rachel?
It's going good, Chris. I'm always excited when we get to do a recording together.
Me too. Like we talk about it all the time, how we look forward to these conversations because you get to powwow with your buddy about what's going on. So what's going on?
So I actually have a consultation that I'm doing later today. And I think it's important to tell this story because I oftentimes get a lot of requests for assessment and, we've heard really great things like, can we come? Can we work with you? And I wish I could help everybody. But unfortunately I cannot. I can't clone myself. But this particular client, I had spoken with, I think in the fall, and had a really good conversation. And they ended up going and getting an assessment somewhere else. And they sent me the assessment report thinking like, we want to, do weekly therapy with Rachel. And unfortunately I had to say, I'm really sorry. I have a wait list for weekly therapy. But I still offer these consultations to help guide clinicians that might be working with these children and, obviously train their circle of support, both parents and ABA therapists and everybody involved. So anyway, I read the report and I was like, they didn't recommend a robust language system, which of course made me cringe. And I had to see this family. And so anyway, they're coming in later today and I'm really excited. And I was thinking about it because I've over time have developed a lot of different recommendations that I give to parents prior to coming in to see me, because especially if I only have, a short amount of time, an hour or 2 hours at the most, typically, I need it to be really productive. And we all know that an assessment is just a glimpse of time. It's a glimpse of a child in a specific, moment of time, typically in an environment that isn't their home. It's not a comfortable environment. So it's even less likely that it's going to be indicative of what they are capable of. And so anyway, I've been developing this list of things that I tell parents. So do you want to know my list, Chris?
Yes, please. I cannot wait to hear what this list is.
I know. Eventually I want to write a blog post because I feel like this should be on the internet where people can find it and read it and share it. But the biggest thing, as we know during assessments, is motivation. And so how can I try to ensure that when a child walks in my door, that they're motivated, right? And they're, excited to communicate. And so one of them is making sure that parents think about all of their favorite things, all of their favorite activities, YouTube shows, sometimes even family members, whatever gets kids excited, that's what I need. And so before parents come in, I always say, I want you to take the next, because typically my schedule is booked out for a couple of weeks. And so I'm like, take the next couple of weeks, think about all the things and write them down, the things that are, your child gets really motivated by. Because I find that parents tend to think of, foods obviously are a really easy one, and specific toys or things that they like. But there's so much more that kids get excited about, right? Like they like going to, Target because they get to sit in the cart. They like to jump on the trampoline. They like when grandma comes to visit. All of these things we can utilize now with photographs and video and all these really cool things. And so the first step is getting parents to think about the things that their kids are actually really excited about, which sometimes, they don't think about these things. They just think about the tangible items. And so that's the first step. And then my recommendation is if there's certain things that a child gets really excited about, like M&Ms is a perfect example. Like who doesn't love a handful of M&Ms? But restricting some access to it before they come to see me. So if they're coming to see me, it's a Tuesday. Like I don't want them to have M&Ms right before they walk in the door. I don't even want them to have M&Ms the day before. I want it to be super exciting. So that when I pull out M&Ms, they're like, oh my gosh, I haven't seen these in a hot second. I'm pumped. Same thing with, I oftentimes get parents to find some photographs. So if they really love grandma, when grandma comes to visit, that's another thing you can use, or a video that they really like, kind of thinking outside of the box, but making sure that, again, we figure out what they're motivated by and then restricting access to it. Because oftentimes when they pull something out, it's like kids are going crazy because they haven't seen it. And so they're really, really motivated to get that thing, right? So that's probably the biggest thing that I recommend to parents.
So can I ask you a couple questions about all that?
Yes.
So first of all, when you ask the question of what does your child like you said, I can feel like a wall or a block go up in a way that like, well, I'm limited to food or like I hear with teachers sometimes they're not motivated by anything, you know.
Yes.
Is there different questions you ask or strategies to draw out what your child likes to get them thinking about the target situation or get them thinking about, besides just a food item?
Yes. I say what makes them smile, what makes them laugh, like, and all these things that we know a child's happy, right? And excited. What makes them jump up and down if they have autism, flap their hands. What gets them really excited. And so and sometimes it's, I've worked with tons of different kids with tons of very interesting motivations, things and activities. And so I think giving parents ideas. And so I always say, make sure you're thinking outside of the box. The other thing that I tell parents is write down all of the ways that they're communicating nonverbally, right? All of the gestures, all of the, even if it's maladaptive, when they're throwing things, when they're throwing themselves on the ground, when, they're grabbing things, like what is causing those things, right? It's like, oh, well, it's because, that's his favorite hat and he doesn't like when somebody else touches it. It's like, it's random things like that, but it's like we can start investigating these behaviors and these gestures and this nonverbal communication to kind of reverse engineer our way back to what could we attach language to that would be meaningful and motivating for this child.
Let me ask you a very practical question. The way you're sort of describing it sounds like you're having a conversation with the parents. And I'm curious, is it like a verbal conversation you're having? You had mentioned how, you're booked out for weekly therapy and how you wish you could clone yourself, right? Or is there some sort of intake form, like in the school district, we call it like a learning inventory or a preference inventory, where the parents or the caregivers are actually kind of filling something out and they're going through like a Google form or a survey or something with those sorts of prompts? Or is it a combination of both? How does it work for you?
So I definitely include that on my intake form. So it's like at the very bottom, it says things that my child gets super excited about. And then it's like, fill in the blank. And then the second question or the last question is, if I could change one thing about my child's communication, it would be. And I feel like those two things are like, that's like the money from the intake form. It's like everything else is like, okay, like fine. But those things tell me what I need in an assessment or a consultation to inspire communication, right? And to get kids motivated and to give parents ideas as to, what kinds of things and activities and target words that they can start working on at home, which is a lot of what my consultation is. Obviously, I do trialing and I help, teach about technology and the specific tools. But more importantly, I try to parents leave with a roadmap. They're like, okay, like here's the, this idea. And of course it's a lot of times it's teaching about core words. So it's like, okay, like we're going to teach core words, and then, but more importantly, it's how can they start integrating into their everyday routines?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Do you find, having done speech therapy for a while, that what motivates a kid is often you? Like they want to come back and see you because you're the fun thing? You know what I mean? Like for instance, there's one thing saying like, I want to go to Christmas with my family because I'm going to get presents. But then there's another thing like I want to go to Christmas, the big family party because my Uncle Mike is there and he makes me laugh. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And he's a goofball and I just want to spend time with my Uncle Mike because he's going to dress in some weird outfit and he's going to, make some sort of off-color joke and we're all going to laugh, And it's this intangible thing that you bring as a speech therapist that like, I just want to be with this person,
Yep. Well, I definitely have experienced that for sure with some of my clients. Some of my clients, especially the ones with autism, they don't always have that. But I feel like kids with autism, they oftentimes have really, amazing memory. And they also love routine. So for my kids with autism, it's like, okay, it's like they can remember when they came in my door, the first thing I brought out, the second thing I brought out. And if the next time they come, it's the same thing, I feel like that actually motivates them to come. They like to know what to expect. They know, okay, this is exactly what we did last time. Like there's no need to feel anxious. There's no need to, get upset. And so oftentimes I think anchoring everything that I'm doing into a routine for children with autism specifically can create a child wanting to come see me, right? Wanting to come to the session because, they know what to expect and they, can anticipate it.
Yeah, yeah. And then after they're into that routine, you could alter it just slightly in a way that it's okay, I'm already comfortable. I'm used to this. Everything's good. This is a safe spot. And now I'm going to just change it just a little bit. How come that thing? And whereas I always go over to the shelf and it's there and suddenly it's missing or it's in a different spot, just enough to prompt the communication. Does that sound about right?
And that sounds like everything I do all day long, right? Mildly sabotaging routines once they're, understood and expected. Yes, absolutely. And that's what I coach parents on too, is like, okay, like they always expect this thing. Like, how can you just change it slightly so that they have to ask for help or they have to tell you what they want? Part of the problem is that kids oftentimes are very savvy in getting the things that they want. And, they have these systems in place and parents never think to question that system or to, interrupt that system or to sabotage that system. So I think that that's definitely a huge piece of it.
Can I go back to the beginning of your story where you had mentioned that they went out and got a private assessment? That assessment did not recommend a robust language system, and you're going to broach that subject later on today with the family. Can you walk us through what that conversation is going to be like? How you anticipate that going? Because I could see it going many different directions, and depending on the family, like, are they coming all excited? Like, oh my gosh, look what was recommended. And you're going to be like bursting their bubble. Or are they like, oh, we hate this. And why is this the recommendation, Rachel? That's where we're coming to you because you wouldn't recommend this. Like, how do you anticipate that going?
So that's an excellent question, Chris, and one I've thought about a lot in this specific situation because parents are typically excited after they get an assessment and they think, oh, yay, like we got an assessment, we did the thing we were supposed to do, and now here's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to start working with this system. And nobody likes flip-flopping around and changing and all these things. But I feel like it's my ethical obligation to inform these parents on the system. And I've already kind of alluded to the fact that I don't necessarily agree with the report. I treaded lightly on that because one, I don't like going against other speech language pathologists and saying like, I don't think this is a good report or I don't think this is a good recommendation, because ultimately I think we all can learn from each other and grow. And I don't want to be the clinician that's like, it's my way or the highway. With that being said, I feel very strongly about robust language systems for kids, no matter what their diagnosis. And so, I need to go into this conversation and it's going to be one of those ones where I have to like start it and see how they respond and then maybe pivot and figure out my words carefully. But explain to them, I want a long-term solution. And that's how I frame it for families is having something that's not robust, having something that, is this like it's good for right now, but it's not good long-term. That's not productive to me. What's productive to me is figuring out a robust language system that we, believe that a child will be capable of using, and we tailor our supports and our teaching to help them learn how to use it. And so I think that every child should have access to a robust language system. And I don't think it makes sense to spend, a month or 2 months or 2 years or however long on, systems that are, to me, what feel like short-term solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think of it sometimes like eating that piece of candy. Like, it's okay to have a piece of candy every once in a while, but if that's all you ever ate, then you're really sacrificing your future, right? Because you will get sick and your body will not be healthy, and you have to have this healthy balance of a long distance goal of like, when I'm older, I want to be healthy. Therefore, I'm not going to gorge myself now on mounds and mounds and mounds of chocolate. I mean, just a little bit. And I feel like that's the similar situation with what you're talking about here is that sometimes we get so focused on this immediate, and I want to immediately fix what's broken right now and make it better. And we do. I'm not saying not to. So we're not just thinking completely in the future. We were talking about the immediate future as well, but there has to be a long game there.
Absolutely. And my other, thing is we can oftentimes emulate whatever, not robust system we can oftentimes emulate that on a robust system, right? Mm-hmm. Like we can make the look almost exactly the same, but we know that we have the capacity to type and teach literacy and, to have morphological changes and, all these things that comprise a robust language system. And so it's just like, For me, it's talking about what my goals are long-term for every child. And of course, that goes back to literacy. And when I see a system that's not supporting literacy long-term, I have a problem with that system.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, speaking of long-term goals, we have some long-term goals for this podcast. And one way that you listeners can help us get those long-term goals and achieve those long-term goals is to sign up for Patreon. So Rachel, tell us about Patreon a little bit.
So our Patreon is a exclusive membership for our podcast where you can tell us how much you love us, tell us how much you love the podcast, and you can support our team. We have a team of individuals that help make this podcast possible, and we want to continue to give to this podcast and give even more once we reach 50 members, which, Chris, we're at 21 right now. I'm really excited about it. We're almost halfway to our goal of 50. Once we get to 50, we're going to open up new behind the scenes content, new tiers of membership so that we can give you guys even more content, figuring out what you guys actually want, have more conversations with you guys. So if you are interested in supporting our podcast and joining our membership, we would love to have you. You can go to patreon.com/talkingwithtech, $8 a month. And I have to give a shout out. Gia is a new member, and I just love Gia. She came to visit me at a talk that I gave in Pennsylvania. And I've already talked about Gia on the podcast, but she might be my number one fan, Chris. I think that she might be my number one fan, and she made me look so cool at one of my family parties. Long story short, I think my aunt was RSVPing to a baby shower or, some type of, event. And she was on the phone with Gia, and she said her name, and Gia said to my aunt, "You don't happen to know Rachel Madel, do you?" And my aunt was like, "Yeah, she's my niece." And Gia was like, "Oh my gosh, I love her work. I listened to her podcast." And so I didn't know about this until I went to a family party a couple months later. And I've never felt cooler than I felt when my aunt was telling this story in front of my entire family. They're like, "How are you in Los Angeles and you have fans in Pennsylvania?" I'm like, "I'm not sure, but thank you, Gia, for making me feel so cool."
That is the best when the work life and the family life cross over because, oh yeah, absolutely. I've got stories to share in the future too. That is so good. That is so good. Thanks, Gia.
I know. Thank you, Gia. So we're happy to have Gia. So please, guys, support our Patreon, patreon.com/talkingwithtech. We're really excited to see where this can go. And it starts with your support. So we would love to have you guys join the Patreon.
So that's not the only long-term goal. We have some other long-term goals besides growing out the Patreon and earning a little money to pay the people that support this show behind the scenes. We also have a goal to get more sponsors, and we are happy to report that that is happening. So what you're going to be hearing here in upcoming episodes is actually something called Teaching with Tech episodes. These are bonus episodes that'll be coming out on top of the regular episode where Rachel and I are reviewing a product.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about this because I feel like a lot of the feedback we've gotten, Chris, both from our webinars and from the podcast is, wow, this is so clinically useful. This is really useful information that I can start applying clinically. And so we know most of you guys are clinicians or parents, all interested in how can I continue to support communication with the children that I'm working with. And I'm really excited because I feel like this episode is going to deep dive with a specific tool or app. And we can teach you guys how we would use this in our practice. And so I'm really pumped to start recording these because it's going to be really awesome. It's going to be kind of like a webinar because we're going to actually have video and we're going to release the video so you guys can watch it as well. But it's going to be a deep dive into a specific tool that you can start using in your practice.
That deep dive is going to be you and I brainstorming back and forth about implementing it. In some cases, we will have implemented the tool with actual clients or students or family members, whatever the tool might be. And then we're going to be discussing what that deep dive is and what those implementation strategies are. I think going back to the goals of our podcast, I think one of the big goals when we first met and we were trying to brainstorm what those would be is that a big need in the field is bridging the gap between research and implementation. And like you said, people have said there's stuff that in this podcast that they can go back and immediately implement. And that actually brings us to the next guest that's coming up. So the interview that we have today is with Dr. Elena Dukhovny, and she is a researcher that has done research Where I had first heard of her is her name kept coming up when I was doing research into motor planning and motor memory. And I kept seeing her name come up in the research articles. And so a colleague of mine, Katie, hi Katie, Katie ran into Elena out at a conference, and they got talking, and she said, "Oh, Chris does this podcast," and she hooked us up and made that connection. And so I reached out to Elena and said, "Would you come on the podcast?" And she said yes, and that is what you're about to hear, is that interview with Dr. Elena Duchovny.
Well, I'm a huge fan of motor planning. I just actually was in another consultation last week, and I had a behavior therapist in there who kept moving the buttons around. And the whole argument was, well, they're not really looking and they're not really, visually discriminating the pictures. And then, of course, I was like, well, let me tell you about motor planning. And so, of course, we went into motor planning and the specifics of it, but it's really important principle for everyone to understand about AAC because, yes, of course, we initially use visual scanning and visual discrimination skills to look at buttons on a device, but then eventually we learn the motor plans. So, the visual doesn't matter as much as keeping those buttons in the same place. So I'm really excited to hear your interview with Elena.
And I should mention real quick that this interview we talk about the motor planning, but it actually goes well beyond that. She has done research in other areas that we talk about. And so I'm going to leave it there as a tease so you can hear right from the doctor's mouth, Dr. Elena Duchovny. Speech Blubs is an app that helps kids make sounds, then words, and then sentences with just 10 to 15 minutes of practice a day. The app has more than 1,500 fun activities for toddlers, preschoolers, and anyone with speech delays. Speech Blubs was designed by speech therapists, parents, and kids too. Video models using actual kids are a big part of its main methodology. Video modeling is an evidence-based practice supported by copious amounts of research to help kids learn language. The embedded videos in the app show kids speaking. The app then invites them to imitate the video model.
Parents know that hearing their child finally say mommy, either with their voice or AAC, is a true milestone. Speech Blubs has more than 1 million downloads, proving that the app could be a great starting point. The subscription starts as low as $4.99 a month for the annual plan, which is a nominal investment to improve a child's speech and language abilities. Anyone can try the app for free for 7 days, but as a listener of this podcast, Speech Blubs is providing an extended trial for an entire month. Simply go to bit.ly/TWT Speech Blubs and complete the form to receive an extended trial. Also, if you're a Talking with Tech Patreon member before April 2nd, 2020, you will receive a free lifetime membership to Speech Blubs. Go to patreon.com/talkingwithtech to sign up.
And check out speechblubs.com for more information about using this engaging and empowering app. That's speechblubs.com. Check it out today. Welcome to Talking with Tech. My name is Chris Bouguet, and I'm here with Elena Duchovny. Am I saying that right, Elena?
Yep, perfect.
So, Dr. Duchovny, I know you don't know this, but I'm fanboying out a little bit right now because I get to do a lot of presentations in my neck of the woods and around the country, and I often cite some of your research. And so I've often seen your name and I've read the research that you've been participating in, but I've never met you, face to face. This is us, one of my colleagues ran into you at a convention or at a conference in Washington, D.C., and you had a conversation. I was like, oh, I know her sort of from her names in her journal articles. Yeah, please hook us up so we can chat. And that's how we got hooked up to do this interview. So for those of you that don't, for anyone listening who doesn't know you or doesn't, know your background, who are you and what do you do?
So I'm a professor in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at Cal State East Bay, and that's across the bay from San Francisco. And I'm a speech pathologist, so I was a clinical speech pathologist for a few years first before I went back to grad school and got my PhD. And AAC is my area of specialization clinically, research-wise. I teach our AAC course, so kind of the whole package.
Gotcha. So how many years would you say you've been working in AAC, just in general?
I graduated from my master's program in 2001 and started in a special needs school in 2002. So that makes it 17 years.
Many years, yeah. That's
There
about the
you
same.
go. I tell my students at the turn of the century. I started practicing at the turn of the century.
So, like when I started this interview, I mentioned that you have done some research and that I've read some of your research. So, one of the questions that I kind of wanted to ask, kind of diving in here about that, is how do you decide what to research? I mean, how do you follow a passion? Is there some sort of dictation from somebody else? I mean, how does it all come about with that you've decided I'm going to do research on topic X, Y, or Z?
Well, how I initially started was this way. When I was working in an all special ed school, it was a school for students with severe, profound developmental disorders, and most of the students were nonverbal, and we used a lot of low-tech AAC, some PECs, some GoTalk type boards or 7-level communication builders, if anybody remembers that. And there came a point where I had to pick a device for somebody, and I had a choice between several, and I realized I had very little evidence base to fall back on to say, oh, this one's going to be better, or this one's going to be better. And that scared me a little bit because I realized we're doing all of this on clinical experience, of which I had very little at that point. And I felt like I really didn't have a good way to say, this is going to work better than this. And I pulled together, I went to ASHA, and there was, I think it was Ken Apel, who was presenting on doing research in the clinical setting and doing single subject kinds of studies. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to try this. And I tried it in my context and presented a poster at ASHA. And somebody was walking by the poster and said, oh, you want to do AAC research and you're from the Bay Area, you should meet Gloria Soto. And that was how I ended up in the doctoral program, thankfully, with Gloria Soto at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. And she was doing intervention research. She does some amazing intervention research. And part of what she was doing was working on building up AAC users' vocabulary. She was doing it at that point through narrative-supported intervention. And I started looking at vocabulary. You with me so far?
I am. I'm following along. And I am totally following because that's exactly, it parallels my own story in that I felt the same way. Like I was making clinical decisions based on what? I don't know, intuition, looking at maybe someone else and saying, well, they're kind of similar and that's what they're using. So yeah, this is really tracking for me.
Yeah, I think it's true for a lot of AAC practitioners. It was true when I started. There's more research now, but also the field is developing very fast. So it's still true that a lot of what you're doing is clinical experience and the practitioner experience as opposed to outside evidence. But in any case, so I started looking into vocabulary, and vocabulary is always a concern when you're working with kids who use AAC. You're always trying to develop their expressive vocabulary and how many words they can access on their device, and also receptive language. And there's two parts to learning a word. One is you have to learn its meaning, and the other one is you have to learn its form. And for people who speak, that form is phonological because we need to then produce the speech sound. So when you see an apple, you have to learn that it's edible and sweet and crunchy, and you could break a tooth biting into it, or all of those pieces. But also you have to learn apple because that's going to have to come out of your mouth, and you're going to have to recognize it when you hear it. But if you're not planning to have that come out of your mouth, or if you can't, do you store that form the same way? You need to remember some other thing about how to get that word out. Does that phonological form take the same amount of space in your head, so to speak, as for somebody who speaks? Because you're still hearing a lot of phonology, but you're not producing, and you're probably trying to produce some phonology because most people who use AC also try to speak a lot, but you're not practicing it as much. But you have this other thing, this keyboard that's in front of you, and you have to figure out how that works. So that was how I came around to well, what do we do in order to produce language on a device?
Mhm.
And at some point during my doctoral program, I found out about the motor planning aspect of PRC, which then evolved into, LAMP and Words for Life and all that.
Mhm.
And I also had some psycholinguistics background. So I had a little bit of theoretical background on what do we do with the phonology of words? How does it impact how we learn words? Which words come to our heads first? If words are similar, how does that affect how we remember them?
Mhm.
So I put all that together, and that was how I ended up with the working memory research.
Okay, so
It was very theoretical.
Sure. Well, theoretical, yet because you had met maybe some PRC users, users of Unity or
Mhm.
a MinSpeak or the semantic compaction, there was some evidence that suggests there was something to this, right? Because there's actually people that were using this phenomenon to help learn words, yeah, and express themselves. Does that make sense?
Yes, exactly. So when I finally met some fluent MinSpeak users, it all came together, and I realized how practical of a question this really was, and how brilliant that whole MinSpeak setup was and is. And the video that I like to show my AAC class is an older video of somebody who uses a PRC device, and you're nodding, so I
know
think
the video.
you know the video. And it's an old video camera recorded grainy video, and they turn the camera on his device, and there are no pictures. And this person, he's a young man at the time, is playing his device like the piano,
Mhm.
effectively. He has no pictures because he knows the system so fluently. Is that the video you're also thinking about?
That's exactly the one. Yes.
So he is talking with his device in the same way that people who speak talk with their articulators.
Mhm.
And that's how the practice, and clearly that's what makes AAC-based communication the most effective, is being able to develop that motor fluency.
Mhm. Mhm.
You start needing supports like pictures and like stories and like models to start building up your practice and to start building up those motor plans. But eventually, ideally, you're doing it as a motor plan. You're blind typing.
Yeah.
And it becomes kind of like human speech in the motor components of it.
I like to say during my presentations that some of the most effective AAC users I've ever met can navigate their device without looking at it.
Right.
Just like you or I might access our keyboard, where occasionally you reference it, you look down and look at the letters, but eventually you don't really need to. You're just typing and you're looking at the screen,
Right, right. When a woman who is a long-term fluent device user said to me, you could put a towel over my keyboard and I could still access all the keys.
Mm-hmm.
So that way, it's a long road, but.
So I remember a number of years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago now, kind of coming to this realization about how the motor planning could inform the motor memory. A big influence on me was Chris Klein and conversations with that guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've had Chris Klein on the podcast, and we've talked about the exact same thing about how it parallels how someone who uses verbal speech, they keep the articulators in the same spot for their speech sounds.
Right.
Well, then the same thing should be, for as much as possible, do that for an AAC user, keep the buttons in the same spot. And it's kind of parallels.
Right.
But I remember coming to this realization many years ago, and then going to try and find, well, okay, what's the research on it? I got the clinical, I've got me and some professionals saying this. I've got that aspect. I've got users that are saying this. Where's the research evidence that backs it up? And that's where things were. There not a lot, but you have done some. So can you talk a little bit about that research and how, what informed it and what looked like and when the outcomes of it?
So actually, can I talk about somebody else's research briefly for a second? Jen Thistle and her co-authors recently published, was it this summer or was it last summer, a study, and I think it's the most recent best demonstration of how stability of location develops motor plans. And I forget what it's called, but I will give you a link so that you can post it at the end of the podcast, because they took some kids over 5 sessions, and they presented them with the same board to begin with, and they had them come back multiple sessions to practice with this board. And for one group, they kept all the words on the board in the same place from session to session to session.
Mm-hmm.
And for the other group, they changed the words around.
Mm-hmm.
And sensibly enough, at the end of 5 sessions, the kids who had all the words in the same place were much faster at accessing those words than the kids for whom the words changed places. So I had tried to do something similar over a single session. I have 2 groups of kids, and for one, the screen would change. All the words would stay the same, but they would be different places on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And for another group, all the words would stay in the same place. And I had them practice over 20 or 30 or 40 just trials.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't enough to show a difference between stable location and not stable location. But what Jen Thistle and her co-authors did is they took it a little bit long-term, and predictably enough,
Uh-huh.
it seems in hindsight, over the 5 sessions, they really showed that keeping things stable improves the fluency of the child accessing the board.
Mm-hmm.
So what I started with in 2012, 13, 14-ish was I took some tasks that were well-established tasks to test the effects of word phonology on people who speak. So in the world of typical psycholinguistic research, there were some well-established tasks. One was a word recall task, where people are asked to recall in order a certain number of words. And there are several different conditions. In one condition, all the words sound different.
Okay.
In another condition, the words that you're supposed to recall sound very similar. So for example, in the first condition, they might be cat, bookshelf, elbow, and mango.
Okay.
And in the other condition, they might be cat, bat, cam, and cab.
Okay.
So they overlap in phonology. So it turns out that for speaking people, it's harder to recall words that sound similar. You make more mistakes on words that sound similar
Okay.
than on words that sound dissimilar. And this is known as the phonological similarity effect,
Okay.
because we remember how words sound. And if we have a mishmash of words that all sound a little bit similar, if we're stretched for brain space, we start mixing up the words that sound more similar.
Uh-huh.
And this is taken as proof that we're storing things in sounds. So when you get a list of cat, bat, mat, you're not storing a picture of the cat and a picture of the bat. You're remembering
How it
at,
sounds.
at.
Okay.
And I thought, can I try to replicate this task and create a device-based similarity effect? And there's also some research on sign language that says for people who are fluent signers, ASL signers, I think it was ASL, they have the same effect, but in sign.
Okay.
So if you're giving people who sign lists of words to remember in sign, if the signs look similar, if they have the same shape and the same direction,
They're going to be harder to remember.
exactly, they're going to be harder to remember. So whatever modality you're in, having that similarity makes things more complicated.
But would that track to someone who's using an AAC system where they have visuals?
Exactly.
Mhm.
So if you have words that all begin in the bottom left corner and then go to the middle right and then go to the top left, and your whole list is that way,
Mm-hmm.
would those be harder to remember than if you have words that start in different places and the second part of the sequence is also different? So you're not always going left, middle, top. but sometimes you're going right, left, top, and sometimes you're going top, bottom, left, and whatever.
Okay.
So I set this up. I created word lists on a MinSpeak system that had similar access. I'm I'm waving my hands in the air because it's so visual, and unfortunately, whoever's listening can't see it. That I'm pointing to different parts of the screen. But so I forced this situation. I created word lists that had similar. I think I called it device-based production similarity or visual spatial similarity or something like that.
Okay.
And I found that, at least in my experiment, it was true. People were having a slightly harder time remembering lists of words appropriately when that sequence was similar looking. What that shows is if you're forced into a device-based production, you start planning and remember things for the device-based production. You're focused on where your hands go, and what you're bringing back when you're recalling these words is where your hands move.
Uh-huh. So let me just make sure I break this down in the right way. So when an AAC user is saying a word and the sequence is very similar, very close to each other, that's going to be harder than when to remember than two words that are the icon sequence is disparate. They're different. They're farther apart. Is that right?
Right. It's going to be harder to remember for this particular task.
Yeah.
Because that's how this task is set up. And in conversation, that'll probably have the same effect as when speaking people try to say words that sound similar, like we have slips of the tongue, and we'll produce words that have the same initial sound or the same number of syllables, or that tip of the tongue sense when you know how many syllables are in a word, but you're not quite sure what the word is. So for AAC users, I think a lot of these effects for the really fluent users translate themselves into a visual spatial modality.
Okay. Can you explain that a little bit more?
So for somebody who is a very fluent device user, effectively a very fluent device typist, they most likely start doing a lot of the same things as speaking people do when they speak. So speaking people will speak a word, and in the back of your mind, that activates some words that sound similar. A device user may produce a word on their device, and it activates some other words that are produced in a similar way on the device.
Like in their brain, it activates.
Yeah. Like if you next ask them for similar sequence words, they might be a little faster to access them. I don't know. I haven't tested it. So
Sure. But it's an interesting theory. I know, again, speaking about LAMP words for life or a Unity system, one of the things I've heard John Halloran talk about this when they were developing LAMP, which of course is based on MinSpeak and kind of I call it a baby sibling of something that has been around for a while. Some similar meaning words are purposefully placed and in different locations. So an example for someone who's not familiar is the word slow, for instance. The first hit is on the left-hand side of the screen, and the word fast, the first hit is on the right-hand side of the screen. They're very far apart, even though they're some people. If you were designing a system, if you didn't know any better, you were just sitting down and going, okay, I wanted to put fast and slow on a system. Well, those things are kind of similar in meaning. Let's put them close together. Like up and down, same thing. Let's put those close together. And I'm feeling like this sort of relates our conversation here.
Right.
Keeping them farther apart makes them, based on what you're saying with the research here, keeping them farther apart makes it easier for people to remember where they are than if they were close together. Am I tracking somewhat?
I remember having this conversation, and it makes it, I think, easier initially to learn. And what I remember clearly is the practical consideration that, for example, if you're asking somebody to make the choice, do you want to go slow or do you want to go fast? And they have to choose slow or fast. If they're in a similar location, if they're right next to each other, there's a higher chance that they'll mishit and you won't know that they mishit,
Yes, exactly.
as opposed to if they're aiming broadly in the part of the screen that's fast and they mishit a little bit to the side, but it's some other completely unrelated word.
Then you really know that was
Then
a
you
mishit.
really know that they meant fast. They just didn't quite make it to that place. So that reasoning I remember well. Thinking back to the motor planning piece, the whole theoretical phonological planning aspect of it takes a lot of time to delve into, but the practical piece is that speech is really fast, and it seems clear and now supported by research, sensible and also now supported by research, that developing a motor plan on a device is the thing that's going to make device-based communication as close to speech rate as possible. I think it'll never be quite speech rate, but that's the thing that's going to get you fastest.
Mm-hmm. So keep the buttons in the same spot as early as possible. So when you're initially giving somebody a communication system, their primary system, of course, the primary, I think of myself, or when I say the word system, that my primary mode of communication is verbal, but then I have all these, secondary and tertiary ways that I communicate. I'm moving my hands now, right?
Right.
And so the same thing with an AAC user. They might have some primary thing, which might be their AAC device, the primary, but then there might be, a secondary or tertiary low-tech board that they use in a certain place or something. But when you're coming up with their primary device, be thinking about that robust language and keeping the words in the same spot right from the get-go. Is that like the right takeaway?
I think so. I mean, I hope that's what clinical SLPs who are out there doing this every day also see, because I'm in a university setting, so I don't see as many users of AAC as people who are day to day in the clinical setting. So I feel this way from research and from the clients that I've seen, but hopefully people who are out in the field more are also seeing this, and hopefully we'll have more research to show this,
to back it up.
It was funny, actually. I'm thinking to my AAC class, and I asked my students the question, what is the argument behind keeping icons in the same place? Because I wanted them to, obviously, to know this part of the field. Mm-hmm. And one older student who is also a parent said, the argument is that if you keep the words in the same place, they're going to be faster and easier to access. And she says, I don't understand why this is even a discussion, because she says, at home, I teach my children that if you keep everything in the same place, it's going to be easier to find.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a beautiful analogy. Like, we like to keep everything in the same place so it's easier to find. Our keys, our umbrellas, all that.
Our books, everything, anything.
Right.
People know that I record in the closet, and you can see it's very clearly organized so that we can find.
But is everything in the same place every time?
Yeah, it would be if we could find things a lot easier if it always was in the same spot, not the mess that's behind me. So let me ask you this then. When it comes to assessments, this is where motor planning, I feel like we need to grow in the field here, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So I've had situations where we've gotten a student from a different school system, let's say, mm-hmm. and they've done an assessment, and they said this kid is going to use Prolo Quo, or this kid's going to use Words for Life, or whatever the system was picked. And I look at the report that was written to kind of justify the selection process, and what they did is they said, well, I gave him Words for Life, or I gave him Prolo Quo for 2 weeks, and we practiced that for 2 weeks. And then I took that system away, and I gave him Words for Life for 2 weeks. And then I took that system away, and then I gave him Touch Chat for 2 weeks, and then I took that system away, and the one that they did best on was Prolo Quo. So that's the one I'm gonna go with. And I feel like there's a little bit of you've been teaching the words when where they've been located for the first 2 weeks, it seems to me like that one influences the other. That they're not separate trials, because the first trial is going to influence the second one. They're going to have to relearn where the word "go" is on Lamp Words for Life if you already introduced it on Prolo Quo. Does that make sense? It makes me question how we're assessing devices. And I feel like that is a very common practice of, well, let's just try this for a little while. Let's try this for a little while. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or again, I'll mention this to Michaela, our editor. We can feel free to cut this out if you want to, because I know I'm throwing this at you. But just tell me I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So my first thought generally is that the system that's the easiest over the first 2 weeks is not necessarily the system that's going to be the most effective in the long term.
Agreed.
Because, for example, a system that has a nice social language and basic requests page up front that you can open and access over the first 2 weeks is going to be really easy over the first 2 weeks. But then when you want to get to more complex language, if you have a kid who is going to want to talk about more complex things like watching the grass grow on their lawn, or playing with ice, like in this one, a couple of years ago, there was a hailstorm in Oakland, and I was in an AAC classroom observing them, and they all wanted to talk about the hailstorm. So the system that's the easiest the first 2 weeks, because it has some basic words up front, may not be so easy to manage once you start supporting more sophisticated, more spontaneous interaction. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the data to say exactly how long you need to figure out which system would be best. Like, would it be helpful to have one system for 4 weeks and the other system for 4 weeks?
Exactly.
But then you're out 2 months and you're not sure if you've been teaching the right thing. So I think clinicians are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because you need to do this fast and you need to have some predictors for which system is going to be best. And I think it also depends on how well the communication partner knows that system. Mm-hmm. As you're setting it up and modeling it. And I'm sure that people who are out in the field more have more predictors that they use to determine, if you have, let's say, Prolo Quo versus Speak for Yourself versus Touch Chat. And those are just names I pulled out of a hat.
Sure.
What predictors do you use to say this one's going to work better for this kid than this other one?
Yes. Sometimes it feels to me like I arbitrarily said 2 weeks, but that's what I've seen other people do. But that's mm-hmm. arbitrary. And is it really 2 weeks, or could it be 4 weeks? Could it be that seems random to me? Like you said, not enough research. And what also seems random to me is often which one people decided to try first. Is there some rationale why you picked this system to trial first? And whatever that rationale is, then why wouldn't you just stick with that system? Do you know what I mean? Why would you pull it away after a certain number of days? Instead, just pick something with a rationale behind it and go with it.
Well, so isn't there a requirement that you have to try several before you recommend one?
Well, only not in a public school setting.
Mm-hmm. So maybe more for medical
insurance
funding.
Yes, exactly, for funding purposes. So let's move on to that. Let's say you've selected a system now and you mm-hmm. understand that you're trying to keep the buttons in the same place. More recently, you've been doing more research on coaching and paraprofessionals. And I know mm-hmm. this, again, is very near and dear to my heart. We have implemented this year in our school district, so I work for a public school district, a coaching model. Mm-hmm. A number of staff members they come to days of training, but as part of that training is an actual coaching mechanism where they get a number of coaching sessions where we're actually analyzing how much they're increasing the amount of partner augmented input. They're mm-hmm, mm-hmm. modeling. And we've seen some great increases in our mm-hmm. therapists and our teachers. So I'm just very curious, what's that research? What led you to do that research? And then what's that research like? And what are the conclusions from it?
So what led me was two things. One was I was doing some of this more theoretical stuff, and I felt like it wasn't close enough to practical outcomes. And I wanted to get back into questions that are closer to improving intervention outcomes. And I had worked with paraeducators in my clinical work, and my colleague Shubha Kashinath, with whom we are doing this project, luckily enough, her area of specialty has always been communication partner support, not for AAC, mostly for early intervention, language delays, autism. And so she and I paired up and created this project. And there was already some pretty good paraeducator coaching research, a couple of studies from Kathy Binger and Jennifer Kent Walsh, and there's two more people whose names I don't remember on that study. But we really wanted to be in the classroom, in the real world setting, because I have felt from my previous work and from my previous research that where things really break down is when you take these methods and really try to, no joke, put them in the real world classroom setting. And you suddenly find out that aided language modeling, when there's 3 kids and one of them needs to go to the bathroom, and this is a new device, and the pair has only been here recently, and you're on the floor and the device isn't in front of, it just doesn't translate. It's really hard, and a lot harder than we make it sound. Mm-hmm. For people, especially for people who are not AAC specialist speech therapists, to do this best practice aided language modeling, to do the weighting, to do the specific feedback piece. So I really, really wanted to be in this real world setting right away and try it in this real world setting and see whether it works. So that was what we did. We found 6 classrooms where the paraeducator was willing to go along with this project, and the teacher was willing to go along with this project. And our only requirement was there has to be at least one. We have 2 requirements: that there has to be at least one kid who uses a device in the classroom, and that the paraeducator has 20 minutes twice a week to spend one-on-one with this kid, which was doable because usually the paraeducators were at a ratio of maybe 1 to 3. Mm-hmm. So they could shuffle things around a little bit to make room to be with this kid twice a week. And we made it, we structured it in a way that the paraeducator had some significant say in what it is that they were learning. So at baseline, we evaluated several skills that we knew to be best practice. And then we came to the paraeducator and said, here are the things it looks like you're already doing well with this AAC user. And here are some things that we think you could do more of. Go ahead and pick 1 or 2 of those things, and let's work on those. And then we came back and coached in the classroom at small group playtime or at snack time or just inside the activity. Mm-hmm. And what turned out was, I think all 6 of our paraeducators, one of the skills that they ended up working on was aided language modeling. Mm-hmm. Some at the single word level, some we were teaching or supporting in figuring out how to model more than a single word, because that's a very tough barrier to cross, at least I found. Mm-hmm. You're nodding, so it sounds like
yep.
You've seen that also. And there were some other skills that we practiced. Weighting, notably, was one skill that we practiced with several paraeducators. And at least for the aided language modeling piece, we did find that the paraeducators became much more comfortable with that over the course of anywhere between 4 to 8 coaching sessions.
Can you quantify that in some way when you say comfortable? Did you have like a rating scale where they like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing with the kids to, hey, now I feel comfortable? Because I know that the Kathy Binger and mm-hmm. Kent Walsh, the article that I think you're referencing is they did in mm-hmm. New Mexico, and they measured that as well, right? Like that they're, the paraeducators just, they felt better about what they were doing every day.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing that we did was we actually counted the number of words that the paraeducators modeled.
Mm-hmm.
So for every session, we transcribed the session and we counted how many words they're modeling, and they're just modeling more words.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And we're also looking at the kinds of words they're modeling. But for now, we know that they're definitely modeling more words.
Can I ask, can you describe what the coaching sessions looked like a little bit? In some cases, for instance, again, in our neck of the woods, that can look a little different based on who's doing it and what their experience level is. And sometimes it's more of a consulting, like, okay, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to tell you, you need to wait more, very directive, or you need to hit the button more times than the student is, or whatever the feedback might be. But sometimes the coaching is, so how'd you think you did today? What do you think? Let's watch this video back. The coach acts more as a reflective mirror, if you will, than telling what to do. And I'm just curious what your experience there is with the coaching. Was it a mix, or did you try to pick one technique over another, or what does that look like?
Great question. So because this was a research study and we were needing to stay true to our intervention, we needed fidelity. We had a protocol.
Mm-hmm.
And the protocol had several important coaching pieces. And also our philosophy was we tried to stay as question-based as we could. So to support the para in their own growth rather than tell them what to do. But sometimes as the expert, you do need to tell people what to do because they just don't have the background to bootstrap themselves into that new skill.
Yes.
So when we came in, we reminded the paras what the skill is that we're working on. And then we stepped back for maybe 2-3 minutes and just observed. And we told them as much. We said, okay, now we're just going to watch for a couple of minutes how this skill is going. And then we came back and said, here's what I saw you do well. Here is a couple of places where I think you could have modeled, or what do you think would have happened if you did something different at that moment? Can you reflect back and think about what did the child want to say in that moment that you may have been able to model? So some of this inquiry-based back and forth. And then we said, okay, in the next few minutes, try more of the stuff that we just discussed. And it sounds a lot more structured than it was.
Sure.
Because when you're in the moment, activities change and
kids are unpredictable.
Kids are unpredictable. They want to talk about something different. You think you were going to build a castle, but somebody came and took all the castle blocks and now there's a water table, and sometimes, life changes. So it's a lot less structured than I make it sound, but we definitely had this protocol. And we actually shared the visual of the protocol with the para so that they had access to what the plan was for that coaching session also.
Yeah.
And then we tried to set them up with, where else do you think you could model some of these words? And actually, this is a little bit of a tangent, but there were a couple of things that I observed informally, and I'm curious whether you've seen some of the same issues. So when we talk about aided language modeling, what I found is sometimes the pairs are hesitant to model the same word multiple times. It almost, they feel like, oh, I have to model a new word every time. So once they get this premise of we're doing aided language modeling, they feel like, oh, well, so I need to start modeling more and more words. And it took a little bit of convincing to say, it's okay, you can model the same word. Kids benefit from that. Speaking kids hear the same word many times before they start producing it. So I don't know if you've seen that.
So we have been, in our neck of the woods, we've been trying to implement a word of the week sort of mentality, in which case we've kind of been advocating that, all right, let's plan for the word put today, or this week. So we're going to actually plan? When can we provide opportunities for us to model the word put? So there is sort of a focus on just modeling this one word. And if you can only learn where this one word is, that's okay. Next week,
Right.
you'll learn where another word is.
Right, right.
Because we've been advocating for that, we haven't necessarily seen a drive to, oh no, I feel like I need to stray from that. Although we don't dissuade that either. Like if you feel like you're comfortable on enough with where the words are and can model a couple more words, do that as well.
Right. And I think there's at least a couple of AAC apps that I can think of that are developing curricula like this. To do precisely what you're saying, to say, here are the 5 words you're going to practice this week.
Yes.
You're going to practice them 5 times on Tuesday. You're going to model them 5 times on Wednesday. And I think that's really promising.
Yes, we have found good success with that so far. So
yeah.
So let me ask, like I said, did the results show that people started modeling more, right? And that they were feeling more comfortable with their role as a communication partner? Great.
Yeah.
That's great. So kind of wrapping this up here, a question that I really like to ask, Elena, everyone that comes on that I get to interview is, I feel like professional development is something that we always strive for, we like to model, that we're lifelong learners. You've been working in the field of AAC for a while now. What has got you curious, or what's got you jazzed? What are you questing after? Just in general, what have you kind of been thinking about when it comes to AAC recently?
So there are practical questions, and there are theoretically curious questions. And the practical question that I'm really excited to pursue is, how do we make our communication partner supports more effective? How do we enrich the aided language environment around our AAC users and make their families and their professionals more comfortable with these devices? It's going to make or break whether this child uses their device to make friends and build relationships and actually speak their mind, is who is around them and how is it being modeled. So the practical intervention piece that I'm really excited about is figuring out more and more effective ways to support communication partners, and really listening to communication partners and figuring out what's going to help them become more comfortable. I have another research project that I'm starting up, looking at a way to support families by giving them just structured time to explore their kids' devices, because I think it's really scary for families and for professionals. Actually, I found this in classrooms also. It's really scary when this device comes in, and I think everybody immediately feels like, oh, I'm supposed to know what I'm supposed to do with this, and I don't. And it's so overwhelming and so guilt-inducing that it really paralyzes the process. And I think figuring out how to gradually support families and professionals is really important. So I'm really excited about that. On the theoretical side, I think in order to figure out the most effective device-based communication, we have to think a lot about spoken communication and conversation and how it works. And I love thinking about the rules of conversation and how are we taking turns and giving up turns, and words does somebody want to say in this particular moment, and how do we remember words, and what does device-based communication tell us about how people remember words in general. And I remember a long, long time ago, this is kind of a sidetrack, there was a really interesting research project, this was before iPads, where I think it was Todman and Alm were the authors. And they asked the question, how do we make AAC sound more natural? So they took the greetings button. There was a greetings button that usually will say something like hello or good morning. And they programmed it to randomly generate slightly different greetings. So it would say, hey, or hello, or how are you? Because that's what happens in spoken conversation. I thought, wow, we have to really think about what's natural in spoken conversation, and having to apply it and program it into a device forces you to think about all of that stuff. And I think it's super interesting.
Oh, me too. That is fascinating, right? I mean, I think just myself, how often do I change what I say? It has the same similar meaning, but it's just like that. Yeah, right? Like, hello, how are you? What's going on? All those are so similar. And I have the option to say all of those. And therefore, I would want to be an advocate for AAC users to be able to say all of those things. And how do you choose in any given moment? That's the thing that's it. Why did that pop out of my mouth instead of this other thing that didn't pop out of my mouth, right? That is fascinating.
Yeah. And it's a big responsibility when you realize you're literally putting words in the person's mouth. It's not to be taken lightly.
Yes.
It's a big responsibility.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so thank you so much for your time and for the work you've done. And I know that everyone's going to be looking forward to the future work that you're doing. And I will continue to share it, read it, and share it with other people. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Chris with Talking with Tech, and we'll talk to you next time.
Please listen carefully.
Hi, I'm Matt Hott, one of the hosts of Speech Science, a weekly podcast bringing you all the information that you can handle related to speech sciences and disabilities. Michelle Wintering, Michael McLeod, and I interview leaders and difference makers in the field. Every Tuesday, we drop a new episode. You can find us on iTunes, Android, and on our website, www.speechscience.org/Speech Science Podcast. Join us as we try to find the answers to the question,
what is communication?
You're listening to the Exceptional Podcast Network.